Nice to see everybody and to be able to be back with you again today. As you are well aware, we're in the middle of a continuing lecture series on rising inequality in the United States. And I'm going to say, in a sense, buckle your seatbelts, get out your pens and pencils. I'm going to get a little bit more technical with you today. So you're going back to college. You tell me, please, remember, those of you who are watching this live, you can hit your bar and interject a question. For the time being, I am going to mute everyone now. And that just keeps the background noise down. But you're able to mute yourselves as well as to put a comment in the chat bar whenever you have a question. So just hit your space bar or put a question in the chat bar, or you can even raise your hand by hovering over your name under the participant list, and then I'll see that you've got your hand raised. All right, so the lecture I'm going to give you today, and let me share the screen with you. It's going to, I guess, take me a moment to get there, is going to try to do a number of things. And I suspect that we'll have to straddle a couple weeks to get this done. But I want to put rising inequality into a global and historical perspective, and also into a more sociological perspective. And one of the ways I'm going to do that is I'm going to look at a just published book, literally just a couple months ago, by Anne Case and Angus Deaton, called Deaths of Despair, and the Future of Capitalism is the full title. Obviously, not a happy title, not a happy phenomenon they're studying. And we've talked a little bit about this together before already, that the mortality rate is rising in the United States. The life expectancy is falling in the United States. And Case and Deaton, who are, Angus Deaton is a Nobel Prize winning economist, are top-notch economists. And it's actually Anne Case, who's married to Angus Deaton, who first made the discovery that the almost exclusive explanation for decreasing life expectancy in the United States is increased mortality among white working class Americans. And in particular, what they call deaths of despair, which are suicides, most obviously, drug overdose, and deaths related to drug and alcohol use. That was the first take. They published an article about this about 5 years ago, which was one of the most widely read articles in economics at the time. And since they've actually expanded their case a little bit to include heart disease. And we'll get into this as we get further into the topic. But one of, I think, the really interesting findings is that apparently heart disease is related, as are increases in suicide, drug use, alcohol use, and deaths related to them. All of them are related to increasing inequality. And the idea that people who have seen their economic standing in this country stagnate or erode or collapse are increasingly feeling tremendous social stress and anxiety. And that social stress and anxiety is driving them to drink, to use opioids. It's also, in the worst instances, actually driving them to take their own lives. But even in those cases where it's not driving them to those extreme measures, the increased stress of increased inequality seems to be directly related to higher instances of heart disease. And so in a sense, part of what I want to suggest is that this is why it's going to take a couple lectures to fully unpack this, that when we understand the deaths of despair phenomena, we will have a better understanding of how inequality works. That inequality isn't just about some people having more money and some people having less money. It's really about social status. And the more extreme differences in social status that a more unequal society create are bad for people in all kinds of ways. And so that's where we're going today. Let me just refresh your memory what we covered together over the last couple of weeks. We started with the idea that we're an increasingly unequal society, and we looked at the way in which the coronavirus is exacerbating those inequalities. We then looked at how we got to be more unequal. And then a little bit about what the pandemic will do to the American and the global economy and how it might change American politics. And I don't know if you've seen that Senator Burr is now under federal investigation for possibly using information that he got as the chair of the Foreign Intelligence Committee in the Senate to make trades that were advantageous to him, in which case that would be a violation of the law. You know, the political shakeout of this is just beginning. But I would suggest to you, especially if the public health officials who've been testifying to Congress yesterday and the day before and today are correct, that this virus may be with us for a long time, and if the economic consequences remain as severe as they currently are, that this may be a event that alters our shared political culture, our understanding of what we can and should expect of government and each other. And so we looked a little bit at that together last week as well. What I want to do today is talk more about inequality in a global and historical perspective, including deaths of despair and the public health, social, and political implications of growing inequality. Before doing that, I just want to note, right, this is data that we looked at together last week, 30 million unemployment claims in 6 weeks. We got new data since we last met, and now we're up to 36.5 million jobless claims. And again, just get a sense of the scale, right? That when we look at the previous year, there's really not any months where you get much more than 100,000 jobless claims, right? And now we're having weeks in which you get 6 or 10 million. I guess it's actually not 10 million, but upwards of 6 million jobless claims in a week, right? And so we're in totally unprecedented territory. As this diagram shows as well, we're even completely exceeding the previous recession by orders of magnitude, right? And by the way, the Labor Department and the Federal Reserve have reported that the hardest hit people, and this is exactly what we anticipated, are those who earn $40,000 a year or less, the people who are in the lower middle class in the United States today. And those people are 40% or 39 to be precise, 39% of the people who were earning at that level in February have lost their jobs in March and April. 40% of those earning $40,000 a year or less. And of course, these are the people who are least capable of affording it. All right, so that's just to bring you up to date a little bit and, you know, talk about what we're concerned about. Let's really transition now into looking at inequality and the rise of inequality in the United States from a global and historical perspective. And so I'm going to start out by asking a kind of academic question: what is globalization? And it's an obviously much used term, but often it's used without much precision. So I want us to have a clear sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about globalization. And so I'm going to start with the idea of, and let me just give you my big footnote right at the beginning, right? And I want you to note that I'm drawing primarily on an extremely important work that was published 2 years ago by a contemporary economist by the name of Branko Milanovic. Teaches at the City University of New York. He's actually from Luxembourg, where he heads an Institute of Economic Studies as well. And it's published, for what it's worth, not just by Harvard University Press, but by the Belknap edition, which is the reserved for the works that Harvard thinks are the most important works being published today. And so I'm drawing on Milanovic's work. I just want you to recognize where my information is coming from, not him alone, in ways that I'll say when we move on. But what is globalization? To begin with, it's the opening of peripheral economies to the global economy. And so to take the most important example of this, in 1979, the Chinese Communist Party made a decision to partially open the Chinese economy to the economy of the capitalist societies of the rest of the world. And they started creating cities that had trading zones in them where enterprises were allowed to pursue profit and trade with the West. And that's a world-altering event or moment, right? China, with a market of 1 billion or more people, with this tremendous reserve, 80% of its population living on $1 a day or less, comes into the global market, the global economy, the global labor supply. But it's not just China. Something similar happens with India. Something similar happens with Indonesia, Bangladesh, Brazil. And at the end of the process where we are now, there are billions of more people integrated into the global economy than there were 50 years ago, right? So that's the first meaning of globalization. The second meaning is that closely related to the first meaning capital, right? Money, large stocks of money owned by corporations or private investors gains access to peripheral labor markets. So when I look at my iPhone, where is it made? Well, it's designed in California, but most of its components are made in China, right? By an American company. When you buy a Ford or a Chrysler today, most of its components are made outside of the United States, right? And so even corporations that are headquartered in the United States increasingly employ people who work for a lot less in other labor markets, especially what I'm calling the peripheral labor markets, the labor markets that are not already directly integrated into the most advanced economies of the West. Third, and much more general meaning of globalization, as this process takes off, new technology is developed. The kind of technology we are talking on together today, right? Which is technology that allows me to communicate to you from 10 or 1,000 or maybe 5,000 miles away, almost instantaneously, right? And that breaks down spatial barriers to economic integration, right? And the result is that there's a new mobility of ideas and capital. If I want to, at the push of a button, I can send money to somebody in China or Britain or Brazil, right? And it gets there basically at almost the speed of light. These are tremendously fast transactions. That couldn't happen 30 years ago, 20 years ago, right? And at the same time, our global transportation infrastructure, whether we're talking about the transportation of persons or the transportation of goods, has been developed in a way that allows for much more mobility of persons and goods than had ever been possible before. And so then the consequence of all this is the integration of global supply chains and productive processes, things that we've talked about together. If you remember that diagram of the Boeing airplane and looking at how many different countries in the world contribute to the components that make up a Boeing airplane, right? That refers to the supply chain and the productive process, that in a sense, almost anything complicated made in the world today has parts that are made from all over the world. And by the way, the materials that those parts are made out of come from even more far-flung places, right? And so we're in a truly global economy. All right, so what has this economic process of globalization done to inequality at the global level and in this country? And I'm going to talk about three phenomena together. The rise of the global middle class. And by global middle class, we do not mean the American middle class. The American middle class is the rich middle class, right? That's to say, it's the middle class of a rich society. America is the richest society in the world. Our middle class is actually not middle class, globally speaking. The global middle class are people who are middle class in China or Brazil or India. And in a sense, they barely existed at the start of this process. And now they are the largest group of human beings on the planet. So that's one consequence. A new middle class, globally speaking, has been created. A second consequence is the rise of global plutocrats, right? And this is a fancy term for the super rich. We will see that the people who Milanovitch refers to as the global plutocrats, each of them own as much wealth as 130 million average people own, right? That's a stunning statistic, right? That they are as rich as many small countries are, right? And so we're talking about the 0.01%, the truly wealthiest people on the planet, and they have become much wealthier as a result of globalization. And then the third dimension of this is the decline of the middle class in societies like the United States, Britain, etc., right? And when I say decline, this refers to two things. First, there are just fewer people who are objectively middle class today. And you know, there are various ways of defining this. What's the median point of income distribution? If we go 50% down, 50% up, we can call that the middle class, right? That was 60% of American society 40 years ago. It's now 40% of American society. So, right, the number of people who meet the technical economic definition of being middle class has declined by 50% as a result of globalization. And there's another meaning of this, which is not just numerically, but economically. People who are middle class have become much more precarious. Their wages have stagnated while important aspects of their cost of living has increased. And the result is that they are struggling to make ends meet, that these are the people who have $400 of savings or less. And so they don't have the capacity to shelter in place, to not go to work, or really to weather any kind of economic emergency, which of course the economic emergencies so many people are experiencing these days are just tumbling down on us. So let's start by looking at this in a graph, right? This actually, I take it back. Let's start by looking at it in terms of these three ideas, right? The rise of the global middle class, the stagnation of the rich countries' middle class, and the emergence of the global plutocracy. Milanovitch thinks this raises three big issues, and in a sense, this is what his book is about. How will China deal with its middle class? And this is just an example, though it's probably the most important example. This is a group that didn't exist 50 years ago today. Today, it's the majority of the Chinese population. And we know from history, once people gain economic security, they begin to feel more entitled. They begin to be less concerned with just getting by. How will I put the next meal on the table? And that tends to lead them to start asking questions about political empowerment, civil rights. What can I do with my newfound economic security? Well, that depends in part on what kind of liberty, freedom, and input I have into how my society works. And so will there be rising democratic expectations in China? And if so, how will China deal with it? In terms of the rich countries' middle class, right? The middle class and lower middle class that has declined in the United States, how will we manage their stagnation, right? Will we find policies that effectively allow us to restore the middle class? Or will we continue to experience decline, deaths of despair, discontent, anger, and anxiety, right? And that determines what kind of countries we live in. Will they be countries in which we continue to be decent to each other, continue to show a certain kind of compassion for each other? Or will they become more fractious, contentious, competitive, hostile, polarized countries? And then in terms of the emergence of the global plutocracy, right, the hyper-rich, one of the questions that Milanovitch raises, really the central question he raises, is what will they do to our politics in the rich countries in the world? And one possibility is that the people who have tremendous wealth will use their wealth to secure political power, that we will turn into a plutocracy. That is to say, a society in which the tremendous concentration of wealth that the hyper-rich have is used to purchase political influence, and in essence, the rest of us lose our capacity to influence politics. Or alternatively, will we get populism? Will we get leaders who rail against the system as being rigged and broken, the deck is being stacked, and say, elect me and I will fix this, right? And who tend to do so by saying, you can't elect a normal politician. You can't elect someone who spent their life and career in politics and comes from the mainstream of the political establishment, because that's the system that's rigged and broken, right? So you need to go outside. You need a rich businessman, for instance, to come in and rescue you from the way in which the hyper wealthy have captured your political institutions. All right, so that's an overview of the big questions Milanovitch thinks we should be thinking about in light of the economic trends he's described. Now let's look at this graphically, and I'm gonna unpack this for you, so bear with me for a moment. What this diagram shows is gains in income from 1988 to 2008. How are they distributed, right? And so on the horizontal axis, on the bottom of the graph, is where you are, where people are in the distribution of income. So these people here are in the bottom 10%, and then the next 10%, and then the next 10%, right? And then on the vertical axis, on the left side of the diagram, right, we've got how much have they gained in income from 1988 to 2008, right? And so during the period of high globalization, right? And what you can see is that the people at the very bottom didn't gain very much at all, right? But by the time you get to the people in the 10 percentile, they actually gained 40% more income over this 30-year period. That's a sharp rise in income, sharp upward mobility. And as we go up the graph, right, it keeps getting better to the point where if we get to the 40th percentile, you've got people who essentially are earning 2/3 as much as they were earning in 1988. And if we get up to the 50th, the 55th percentile, we've got people who are earning 75% more than they were earning 30 years ago. So very rapid increase in income. And this is then the rising global middle class, right? That's the group A that Milanovic is referring to. And please note, it's the vast majority of the human population, right? From the 10th percentile to the 70th percentile, we're talking about almost 2/3 of humanity has benefited from globalization in terms of their income. But then we get up to the 70th percentile to the 90th percentile. And this is what Milanovic calls the rich middle class. It's the middle class, the lower middle class, and middle class of a society like ours, or Germany, or Britain. And what we see is that incomes have risen much less for the people who are middle class in rich societies, to the point where when you get to the 80th percentile up to the 90th percentile, right, they've risen not at all, or less than 10%, right? They're doing even worse than the poorest people in the world, not in terms of their absolute share of wealth. They're still in the 80th to 90th percentile, but in terms of its growth. And please note, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, in America, in the post-World War II period, from roughly 1950 to roughly 1980, right? The period immediately preceding the period that this diagram shows, these people's income was rising rapidly, often 20% a decade, sometimes as much as 4% a year, right? And to go from a period of rapid income growth to a period of complete income stagnation, that gives rise to a problem of what's called rising expectations in the sociological literature. These people who are relatively rich compared to most of the rest of the world, but have seen their incomes stagnate, expected their incomes to go up. And then there's a third group, and that's concentrated at the very far end of this graph, right? Really, it's only when you get up to the top 2 or 1% that you again see very steep increases in income. And that's then what Milanovic refers to as the global plutocrats. I'm going to keep going with this. And one of the things I want to explain by way of these graphs, and by all means, please let me know. Oh, good, we're up to 19 people. I'm so happy to see that. Raise your hand or unmute yourself if you have a question, if this is not making sense. And I know I'm being somewhat technical here, but I want you to understand this as objectively as possible. So we need to look at a little bit of data. And so this is,
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead. Who is that?
Me, it's Lois. My question basically is, if I buy his book, will I be able to understand it? Because I'm having trouble, and I have a good education, and I'm still having trouble understanding all of these numbers and everything.
Yeah, so what I would say to you is twofold. On the one hand, he's very good at writing in a way that isn't terribly technical, right? And so I think word by word, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, you'll be able to understand the book. But he is an economist, and in a sense, he's an economist, right? And so there's a lot of data analysis in the book as well. Some of it gets quite technical, and he actually separates out the technical sections from the ordinary language sections. I'm not sure that anyone who doesn't have a technical background in economics, myself included, understands all of the technical work that he's doing. So I guess my answer is mainly yes, you'd be able to understand it, but there'd be parts you wouldn't be able to understand. Let me keep going, and I'm going to do my best to make it intelligible to you. And on the other hand, please keep interrupting me if there's stuff that doesn't make sense, because I'm not doing my job if I'm not helping it make sense to you, right? All right, so there's an old joke on people who present diagrams like this, which is for each diagram you present, you lose half of your audience. I'm in trouble if that happens, so ask me, please. Here's a diagram that compares 1988 to 2011. And please note, it's a slightly different time period. We were comparing 88 to 2008 before, and now he's going Milanovitch, this is all from Milanovitch, ahead to the aftermath of the Great Recession of 2008, right up to 2011. And for those of you who look at distributional curves, right? There's the famous bell curve, looks like a bell, right? And that's meant to be a concentration in the middle and then declining amounts of people belonging to either extreme, right? And that indicates a relatively even distribution. In this case, we're talking about per capita income. And the dark line is 1988, and that's not a bell, right? That's biased to the left side of the diagram, which is where lower incomes concentrate. So in 1988, around 80% of the people in the world, right, were in this area where they were living on around 300 to around $600 a year, right? That's $1 or $2 a day. That is absolutely desperate poverty. And what we see is that by the time we get to 2011, that's a much smaller share of the population. And actually, many more people are living in the $1,000 to $10,000 per year range. Now, $1,000 a year still isn't great, but it's a lot better than $300 a year. And so again, what we're seeing here, and I want to be clear about this, is that at exactly the same time that we were getting more unequal in the United States, the world was getting more equal, right? And many people were lifted out of poverty. And so, right, as I've said, 80 to 90% of the Chinese population in 1979 was living on $1 a day or less. Today, there's almost no one in China living on $1 a day or less. And that's reflected then in the fact that we've got a much fairer or much more equal distribution of income in 2011 than we did in 1988, even though the middle class in the United States took it on the chin over that same period. Now, this in a sense gives you a much clearer sense of what's happening. And please note, we're not comparing apples and apples in this diagram. We're looking at the United States and China. But in the United States, we're looking at people who are from 10 to 20% of income, right? So relatively poor people. And in China, we're looking at the people who are from 70 to 80% and urban, right? But what we see, in other words, is if you are lower middle class or working class in the United States, and if you are upper middle class in China, you started this period living in different worlds, right? The Chinese making, less than $1,000 a year, the Americans making more than $5,000 a year. And at the end of this period, right, the Americans are essentially still making almost exactly what they were making in 1988. But the Chinese upper middle class have really closed the gap, so to the point where it's a negligible gap between the Chinese upper middle class and the American lower class, right? And so again, that's an indication of a kind of trade-off in terms of inequality. And now here's my question. Let's say you're a globalist or a cosmopolitan, as it's sometimes called. That's to say, you care not just about how people in this country are doing, but you care about humanity, right? Another word for this would be you're a humanist. You care equally about everyone in the world. Well, should you be more concerned that the middle class in the United States is stagnating, or that the lower classes in China and India and Indonesia are doing better? And there's two ways to think about that. One of them is, what's the percentage of the world population? And as you can see, if you combine India, Indonesia, and China, right there, you've got about 50% of the population of the world. Whereas if you look at the United States, you've got only about 5% of the population of the world. And then if you think about it in a second term, who are the least well off? Who are the people who really need to be improved? Again, the people in India, Indonesia, China are doing much worse off than the people in the United States, who are the richest people in the world, practically speaking. So if you're a cosmopolitan, if you're a humanist, how should you react to this? And before I say automatically that you should be happy about this, let me complicate the picture a little bit and go back here, right? We've got three groups here. We've got the global middle class, right, doing much better. We've got the American middle class, or the middle class of the rich countries of the world, completely stagnating. And we've got the global plutocrats, the top 1% of the population, who are getting much richer. I think part of the question we've got to ask is, how much of the stagnation of the middle class in a society like the United States is due to the fact that people in China are getting a bigger slice of the global pie? If that's the primary explanation, if some of the work that used to be done in the United States by relatively high wage workers is now being done in China and India and Indonesia and Brazil and Mexico, and it's being done by workers who earn less but who are earning a lot more than they used to earn, then maybe that's not an altogether bad thing. We've redistributed from people who are doing reasonably well, globally speaking, to people who are not doing as well. And on the other hand, a second explanation would be, well, actually, the reason that the middle class in the United States is so stagnant is because the very rich are taking a larger share of the pie, right? And if the very rich took less, there would be enough to go around for the global middle class and the American or rich middle class, both to do better. And so the real problem here is not movement of income from the rich middle class to the global middle class, but movement of income from the rich middle class to the global elite. And I'm not suggesting that it's as simple as that, but I think in a sense, part of what we see when we look at a diagram like this is that part of the way that these people got so much richer was by taking jobs and income from the middle class of rich societies and transferring it to an emerging middle class in poor societies. And so we do have to be sensitive to that. And so finally, if we look at the overall outcome of this, and I'm not going to ask you to make sense of this, but what you can see is just generally speaking, This is how unequal a society is, right? It's called a Gini coefficient after the Italian mathematician who invented it. And basically, as you go up the Gini scale, you get more and more unequal. And so what you're seeing is that globally speaking, the world got more and more unequal until the last part of the last century, until the 1980s and 1990s. And since then, it's actually been getting a lot more equal. Whereas in the United States, America got a lot more equal in the middle of the 20th century, and then started getting more unequal right around the time the world was getting more equal. And that's the thing that it seems to me is, in a sense, vexing about this, is it's hard to pull apart America getting more unequal from the world getting more equal. Those two things have gone together over the last 50 years. All right, so now why don't I pause for a second and see if you've got any questions about that before I get into the historical dimension of Milanovich's analysis. Anybody with a question, go ahead and hit your space bar and unmute or raise your hand. Please let me know if I can clarify anything or if there are any issues you want to discuss. No? Stanley, go ahead.
Muted. Oh, okay. One thing that you haven't mentioned, which I think is important, is that although income has stagnated for the middle class, there's a lot more that you can spend your money on. In 1988, nobody had a smartphone. A lot of the new inventions weren't available, and people have much more things to spend their money on.
All right, that's your main comment, right, Stanley?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
And I showed you a diagram a couple times in the last couple of weeks, and I don't have it in this slide set, but maybe if I describe it to you, you'll remember it, in which we looked at the costs of different goods. Some of them in red, those were the ones that were getting more expensive. And some of them in blue, those were the ones that were getting less expensive, right? And what we saw in that diagram is that the goods that are subject to globalization have become less expensive. So not only did we not have smartphones 20, 25 years ago, but when they first came out, they were very expensive, right? And you can still spend an awful lot of money on a smartphone if you want to, but you can also get a pretty damn good smartphone. As a matter of fact, one that's a lot better than what would have cost you 4 times as much 10 years ago, right? And so technology, computers, automobiles, clothing, all of this stuff has become more affordable. And in a sense, thank goodness that it has for the rich middle class, because in a sense, it's allowed them to maintain their standard of living despite the fact that housing has become a lot more expensive, or medical expenses have gone up astronomically, or the cost of education has gone up astronomically, right? So there's a kind of offsetting going on, and you're absolutely right that part of the reason that a smartphone is not only available, and there's a famous conversation between Steve Jobs and Barack Obama, in which Obama asked Jobs what it would take to get Apple to come back to the United States and make its phones here. And Jobs says, there's nothing you can do. And he gives an example of discovering a problem with his screens in one of the iPhones, and basically deciding they've got to pull all the screens off the iPhones and put new screens on. And the factory in China is given notice that they have to do this. And in the middle of the night, they wake their workers up who are sleeping in dorms on the grounds of the factory. And the workers go to work and start doing it. And so Apple's phones get to market with the right screen on time, right? And Jobs said, you'll never get that in the United States today. And he's absolutely right. So it's not just that the labor is cheaper, it's also more compliant. It does what management tells it to do in a way that the American workforce were too rich, but we're also too entitled, rightfully so. Don't get me wrong. You know, the problem here is that the Chinese are too compliant, not that American workers are not compliant enough. But yes, this has resulted in products being built to a very high level of specificity, technical expertise at very low costs, and American workers have benefited from that. That is absolutely right, Stanley. I'm going to come back to you. Give me a second. I'm trying to get you unmuted. Does that cover what you wanted to talk about, or do you want to follow up?
Yeah, well, one more question. What do you think will happen after a while as the salaries in China and other places go up? Won't the same problems that exist all over the world as here?
Say it one more time. Will they have the same what?
Won't the incomes in China continue to go up until it presents the same problem as it does here?
Well, and so I'm beginning to wonder whether you've read the book already, because you're exactly right, which is to say Milanovitch predicts, among other things, that it's possible that that American inequality is not going to just keep going up and up and up, in part because the wage differential between the United States and China is closing, right? If you look at this graph, right, and this doesn't capture the total differential, but if you're Apple and you got to pay this group, right, pretty soon you're paying them almost what you're paying the American workers. Why not maybe make your product in America instead of in China? And so the question here is really one, in a sense, about Bangladesh, right, which has a situation very similar to the situation China had 40 years ago. A whole bunch of people working in a subsistence agrarian economy who could move to the cities and start doing this kind of work and do it for a lot less money than the people in China are doing it for right now. And so will the jobs come back to the United States, stay in China, or go to Bangladesh, right? That in a sense, that's one of the big questions we don't know, but those are all three possible scenarios. Good, okay, so thank you for the good question, Stanley. Anybody else with a question at this juncture? Then let me continue. Oh, so who is that? Go ahead. Anne, Fran.
I think the type of product that's going to be created by this is two different lines of production. The Chinese and the Asians are going to take over the low-cost goods, and and the Americans are much more innovative and will come out with solar panels and other biotech stuff that will then create more money in this economy.
Well, I in a sense, I want to say I hope that you're right, Fran, because in a sense that's a good scenario. That's the kind of scenario that economists typically envision, which is what's sometimes called a relative advantage scenario. We're more efficient at biotech, you're more efficient at manufacturing, you do the manufacturing, we'll do the biotech. We'll both be better because you'll get biotech that you want, we'll get cheaper manufactured goods that we want. The Chinese are in the middle of a 5-year plan, and they've actually got successive 5-year plans. Their current 5-year plan calls for a transition to what's called higher value added labor, right? And so one way to think about this is in terms of Germany, right? Germany at this point doesn't produce much. I think the technical term here is schlock, right? It doesn't produce cheap stuff. It produces BMWs and Siemens washing machines, et cetera, right? And so that's the stuff where their employees, their labor force, gets relatively high wages because they're relatively well educated and do really good work. And so they make the high tech stuff. And you know, China has said, we want that too, right? And so they're in the middle of an economic plan to try to transition from low to high value added goods. And so if they do that, it's possible that 10 years from now, what you're saying is no longer true, that the Chinese are as good as the Americans are at the high value added labor. By the way, one of the reasons we've got a trade war with China, or had a trade war before we had a global pandemic disrupting everything, is because Donald Trump and companies see this coming, and they're trying to head it off. And in particular, though the trade war didn't focus, I think, as precisely on this as it should have, the Chinese are stealing a lot of technology and information from American and European corporations in order to be able to change their labor force. I know you want to come back on this issue, Fran. Go ahead.
No, that's what I was going to say. They cheat.
Yeah, they cheat. Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other comments at the moment. And I do want to try to give you one more topic today. And so I'm just going to finish out this lecture, this portion of the lecture, by looking at one more thing here, which is what's happening with wealth. So far, we've been looking at income primarily. And if you look at the top 1% in terms of income, at around 2000 and around 2010, there's not much of a difference, right? 14.5 as opposed to 15.7% income. Please note that that's still an awful lot. 1% of the world's population is making 15% roughly of the world's income, right? That means that the remaining 99% is fighting over 85% of the income. But when you look at wealth, the discrepancy, the growth in inequality is much sharper, right? The top 1% had basically a third of the world's wealth in 2000. It has almost half the world's wealth in 2010. And so in a sense, if we're worried about plutocracy, we need to be worried not about how much the very rich are making year by year. That's a problem. But we really need to be worried about how much they own in assets, right? And here I want to say it's obscene, right? That we've got, and this I believe is the 0.01% of the population owns 6% of the world's wealth. So, right, this is, and it's basically more than doubled over the period of globalization. And this means that these people own as much as 130 million average people own. We have a real problem here. When we begin talking about solutions, this is where one of the places I'll want to really concentrate. All right, so now let's begin talking about history for a few minutes. And one of the things Milanovitch is interested in is how inequality changes over time. And this is unnecessarily complicated to put this in a graph. Let me just talk it through to you. Again, this is a Gini coefficient, right, where 0 is complete equality, 1 is complete inequality. Complete inequality is where basically one person owns everything and everybody else owns nothing. And what this basically shows you is that the richer a society gets in terms of average income, the more inequality is possible, right? If you're down here, where basically the average income is a subsistence income, you're making just enough to live. If you start getting too unequal, well, people are going to die, right? Because they're going to be deprived of the resources they absolutely need to live. And either your society is going to collapse, or you're going to be unable to continue making goods and selling them, right? And so great inequality is only possible when wealth average income goes up. And one of the questions then is, if average income goes up and inequality gets too high, does it actually drive average income back down? In which case, right, there might be a kind of self-curing mechanism here, right? Is inequality a self-curing disease? And in a sense, Milanovitch thinks historically, and he goes back hundreds of years with incredible data, that what we see is each time societies get more unequal, they top out and then they become more equal again. And he suggests that when you look at this history, there are two kinds of forces that are equalizing forces in history. One of them is malign, right? It's a bad thing that happens. Sometimes it's an idiosyncratic event in a society with a stagnant income, a disease, for instance. And sometimes it's a war, civil conflict, or state breakdown, or an epidemic, right? Please note, epidemics are one of his equalizing events. In societies with rising incomes, and remember, that's where greater inequality is possible, wars tend to happen when society gets too unequal. And this, I think, is a very important thing that Milanovitch is suggesting. When society gets too unequal, two things happen. The first is that the people in your own society can't afford to buy all the goods your economy is making, and so you tend to look for other markets. That means imperialism, right? And imperialism often generates war because you're not the only country looking for other markets trying to dominate other societies. The other thing that happens is nationalism. You try to distract your population from the fact that things are so unequal by giving them something else to think about, right? Including the idea that the sun never sets on the British Empire. You should be proud to be British as opposed to be worried about forming a labor union, right? And so that can also lead to war. Also, you get civil conflict, revolution, state breakdown. So these are the bad forces, right? But there are also some benign forces that produce equalization in human history when societies become too unequal. One of them is social pressure, right? Through politics, people form unions. They support social democratic or socialist parties. They call for progressive taxation, right? And the suggestion here is, as I've kind of said with the case of China already, when you've got low income, people are just struggling to get by. When you begin to get higher income, people can think more about more elevated things like fairness or justice, right? And that can generate social pressure to be less equal. Widespread education. And so there are two ideas here. One of them is just as you get wealthier, there's more money to spend on education. But the second thing is that a more complex economy demands more educated workers. And so even capitalists are in favor of better education systems because they recognize that in order to compete with the labor forces of other countries, your country needs to have a decent education system, right? Third thing, life expectancy tends to go up as societies get richer, but people don't work their whole lives, right? People expect at some point to be able to retire, or else they simply become incapacitated, right? They can't work in the way that they used to work. And then people who are older tend to be esteemed, respected, connected to younger generations who have care and affection for them, and they want to make sure that they do okay, right? That they're not abandoned to poverty and vulnerability in their sunset years, as we say, right? And so you get a demand for social protection. right? Welfare, Social Security, pensions, Medicare, etc., right? And that tends to be expensive. And so you get a demand for taxation to fund it. And that tax tends to fall primarily on the rich because they're the ones who can afford to bear it. And therefore you get a redistribution as a result of an aging population. Finally, the fourth factor here is technological change that favors low-skilled workers. And so in a sense, this is kind of the opposite of what Fran was saying a few minutes ago, which is that if labor gets too expensive in your society, people will innovate to try to figure out ways to use less skilled labor to do the same stuff that the skilled labor is doing, right? And if they succeed, then the premium that high-skilled labor gets may go down because there'll be less demand for it. And the wages for low-skilled labor may go up a little bit. And so you get an equalization as a result of technological change in the economy, narrowing the wage gap between those who are high-skilled and low-skilled. I want to introduce one last idea to you today. And I'm sorry that this is jargonized, but I think you can understand this pretty simple. This is named after a man, Simon Kuznets, who won a Nobel Prize in economics in the middle of the 20th century. I believe he's Hungarian, but he spent most of his life teaching economics in this country. And he actually suggested a curve, not a wave. And it was a U curve, as they say, an inverted U curve. It looks like an upside down U. This is not perfect, but it's pretty close, maybe kind of an upside down cursive U, right? And the idea was basically that during the early phases of capitalism, inequality goes up and up and up. But that after it gets to a peak, these kinds of self-correcting mechanisms, whether they're benign or malign, that Milanovitch has presented to us in that table, kick in. And the result is that inequality is actually driven down. And Kuznets predicted really in the middle of the 20th century that we would see declining inequality. And he predicted this kind of at the height of the Gilded Age. And that's part of the reason he won a Nobel Prize, is his prediction was so accurate, right? That actually what happened in the second half of the 20th century, the 30 years after World War II, is that inequality went down and down and down. Now, here's what Milanovitch adds. Well, Kuznets was right up to a point. And let's call that point 1980, right? And then what happens in 1980 is inequality starts going up again. And so many economists, some of you may be familiar with Thomas Piketty, for instance, have said Kuznets was wrong. And Kuznets was thinking about the middle of the 20th century as if it was normal. But actually the middle of the 20th century was highly abnormal. We just had 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and a communist revolution in Russia. All of those things tended towards equality by destroying wealth, increasing taxation, creating greater solidarity, emboldening socialists. But that faded. And when it faded, the world went back to normal. And the normal world is a world of inequality and growing inequality. That's what Piketty says. And the question Milanovitch poses, the hypothesis that he favors, is that actually maybe what we have is waves, not a curve, right? It's not just going up and then down and staying down. It's going to go up again. But maybe inequality in the middle of the 21st century will go down again. And then maybe, who knows, the end of the 21st century, it'll go up again. Maybe this is a kind of seesaw of inequality and equality. And that it's the fact that too much inequality triggers the forces that tend to produce more equality. So there's a big debate in contemporary economics between Thomas Piketty, who says, no, inequality is just going to keep going up and up and up, and people like Milanovitch, who say it's going to go up and down and up and down. And so again, seeing it in a historical perspective raises these very interesting questions about whether we should think of the current moment as being really alarming. We're on an upward trajectory of inequality that there's nothing we can do about, or as being perhaps a kind of moment in a longer process in which inequality may be corrected for by the very forces that inequality unleashes. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I've got another couple minutes, and please tell me if you have questions. I believe you should be able to just hit your space bar, but if you can't, you can raise your hand. Go ahead, Anne.
Yes, I have a comment to make. 70 years ago in Canada, I worked in the needle trade. I worked in an office in the needle trade. Then the Chinese came in and started to copy our designs. And we went through a period, don't buy anything that has a Chinese label on it. Well, they went a long way since then. And I would not expect them not to be able to make Mercedes or any of the other cars. It will come to a point where they will be able to do it. They have the will and they conquer.
Yeah, and so I take your point, Anne, and there's, you could talk about needles, you could talk about cell phones, you could talk about providing the infrastructure for the internet and wireless communication. You could talk about automobiles, right? And so yes, the Chinese clearly have a highly centralized form of political rule. And this is sometimes now referred to as state capitalism or autocratic capitalism to differentiate it from democratic capitalism. And they are not only strongly committed, as I've already said, to increasing the value added component or the high value component of their labor, right? But to doing so by learning from the rest of the world, in part by stealing what's sometimes called the intellectual property of the rest of the world. How is an iPhone built? Well, maybe we can take it apart and reverse engineer it, and then Huawei can make a phone like that as well, right? I actually have a friend who's a intellectual property lawyer for Google, and he says it's the Wild West in China. His primary focus is actually on protecting Google's intellectual property in China, and he says, there are days when it goes well, when it looks like the Chinese are actually willing to respect the global treaties and rules around intellectual property. And there are days when you just have to say, well, they're the biggest kid on the block right now. They've got 1 billion people who are increasingly rich, and we just got to do what they tell us to do. And if we want access to their market, we play by their rules, right? And so yes, there's tremendous power there. I do have to say, I'm not a huge fan of the impact of global trade agreements on American labor. They've been very destructive for wages in the United States. But the trade agreement that the United States and many other countries was negotiating with China, I think had some very important provisions. This is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that would have done something about protecting intellectual property. Maybe if we could have beefed it up a little bit, done something about environmental regulations, as well as labor rights. And that in a sense, we don't have any choice in dealing with China other than to try to beef up international regulations, rules, regimes. And that unfortunately, we're going the unilateral route right now. I don't think it's a route that we're going to prevail on. And we'll have to see if, maybe November brings a change of course. And maybe the United States can start doing smarter things than launching trade wars to try to protect our intellectual property, our workers, our environment against Chinese competition. Having said all of that, I also want to say, if you're concerned about equality and humanity, the fact that Chinese labor is making more than it was making 30, 40 years ago is a good thing. It's a benefit to hundreds of millions of people. All right. Thank you for the good comment, Ann. Anybody else have a comment or a question?
I have a question.
Go ahead, please.
Hello. We didn't touch on the subject of the impact of war. And you had it on that last chart as a negative in 2 different places. But wars and the reason for wars, I'm not an economist or anything, but the wars are they could be caused by inequality. They could be caused by, I don't know, all of I read a book not too long ago that it was inevitable that there'd be a war between China. Come in.
You like the red wine?
Yeah, white, no, beer.
We don't have any beer.
Oh, okay, red wine then.
Okay. So I think I've got the question, and because there's background noise, I'm going to go ahead.
No. My question is that the book I just not just
Tomorrow, okay?
on China and the inevitability of war had to do with their economics and growth, and this book traces all of that and decides war is inevitable with China because of all of these factors. And I was this book and these charts mention war in 2 different places, and then there's nothing more said about wars.
All right, Lois, thank you. And I'm going to pick up on that comment and elaborate a little bit. So you're absolutely right. I got the chart back up here, right? War is mentioned as a malign equalizing force, and malign in the sense that as opposed to redistributing wealth, it destroys wealth, right? And in a sense, Milanovitch is saying those are 2 ways to equalize society. You can just destroy the wealth that rich people have. And in states with stagnant incomes, that's what war tends to do. In states with rising income, war is still destructive, but it's also the case that in order to finance war, you have higher taxes. And in particular, in order to finance war in a democracy, you can't raise taxes on the very people you're asking to fight the war, right? The vast majority of the population is middle class or lower middle class. If you've got total mobilization, you're enlisting them, you're asking them to go fight, you got to pay them, right? Because often what you're doing is taking the breadwinner out of their job and putting them on the front lines of the war. You've got to pay them. In order to do that, you've got to tax the rich. And so in a sense, war is a direct transfer from the rich to the middle class, the lower middle class, the working class. And so that's one way in which war is redistributive. Secondly, and I think every bit as important, is once the war is over, the people who fought in the war come home. And in a sense, they have changed expectations, right? They have defended their society. They have been treated as equals. They've been placed on the front line in harm's way with guns in their hands. And now they come home and they say, we've learned to stand up for ourselves a little bit. We've learned about our significance to the society. We have higher expectations now, right? So in both those respects, wars can be redistributive. Now, here's, I think, coming to what you're referring to, Lois, in terms of what you're reading right now. one of the arguments that Milanovitch and others make, and this is one of the ways in which he differs from Thomas Piketty and others, and I'm going to put it in economic terms at first, and then I'll unpack the jargon. Piketty views war as exogenous, right? It's something that comes in from the outside. It's not caused by economics. Milanovitch says, actually, no. War is potentially endogenous. It comes from the inside. It's generated by too much inequality. When you get too much inequality, two things happen. The first is that the people in your own society can't buy the goods you're making. And so you've got to go compete with other countries for foreign markets. And that tends to generate conflict internationally. And I've got you muted, Lois. Let me unmute you because I hear.
No, I was only going to say that that's what this book is about.
Good.
And this inequality is inevitable, and if inequality is inevitable, war is inevitable, and I don't know. So
Yeah, no.
anyway, okay, that's all.
So same basic idea. And then the other thing is that war is a strategy, maybe not war, but nationalism is a strategy that's sometimes used by leaders who are trying to distract workers from the level of inequality in their society, right? And so in a sense, we see this in China today, that China is much more nationalistic than it has been for a long time. And part of the reason is probably because there are growing pressures for democracy and human rights and civil rights. And one way to distract people from wanting more and better is to say, you're part of a great nation and you need to come to the defense of your nation right now. Now's the time for all good men, right? And so that is a further reason why high inequality sometimes leads to war, and then war sometimes reduces inequality. So excellent. I certainly hope that the US and China are not on an inevitable path to war. And this would come back to the comment I was making a little while ago about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and better international trade agreements than we've had in the past, which is that there are two ways to do this. One is through unilateral competition. The other is through multinational institutions. And I think given the extent of globalization, we would be well served to be strengthening multinational institutions today. All right, everybody, really good questions. I'm glad you were following and questioning and bringing good critical comments to this. We will pick up where we left off next week, and we will move into the stuff on deaths of despair. Take care,
Professor?
Yes?
Can you remind everybody that it's on Thursdays?
I think you just did, but yes, we're switching our meeting time to Thursdays at 2 because that works best with the rabbi's schedule for Friday afternoon. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Good. I'm glad you do. And I appreciate getting to spend some time with you guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.